Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? Great. Well, thank you so much for being here this afternoon to this panel titled Protecting Mental Health in a Climate Crisis. My name is TORI Choi. I'm a climate justice activist and campaigner. I'm a senior advisor for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and a consultant and advisor to the Stop Rosebank Coalition. And 2 years ago, I had the absolute privilege of writing a book where I interviewed young people about their impacts and their sort of experiences with mental health in a time of climate change. And, you know, as we just heard, this is quite a nascent topic in the field of, the discourse, the wider environmental discourse, but the reality is that the impacts of climate change on people's well-being is nothing new. And so in order to explore the sort of depth of this field and answer some really pressing questions, I am joined by some phenomenal experts, researchers, panelists, and I'm going to start with Dr. Colin IWUJI, who is a professor of global health and HIV medicine at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, University of Sussex, and a faculty member in population science at the Africa Health Research Institute in South Africa. His research focuses on evaluating interventions, strengthen health system resilience to extreme weather events, the intersection of climate change with HIV, and the impacts of climate change on mental health. And then next to Collins is Professor Andrea Miceli, who is a clinical psychologist and a professor of early intervention at mental health at King's College London. He is the principal investigator on Urban Mind, a 10-year project which explores how living in cities affects mental health in urban communities. His current research focuses on the negative impact of heat waves and air pollution on mental health, which is very relevant to London. And he is especially interested in how urban nature can mitigate these negative impacts and support mental resilience. And then on my far left is Sarah Klein, co-founder and CEO of United for Global Mental Health, a UK-based global mental health charity that exists to advocate, campaign and fundraise for greater political and financial support for mental health around the world. And over the course of her impressive career, she has developed and delivered successful national and international campaigns and initiatives aimed at governments, international institutions, and political parties at the highest levels. And dialing in from Portland, Oregon, is Dr. Thomas Doherty, who specializes in applying environmental perspective to mental health and well-being. Thomas provides individual and couple services through his business Sustainable Self and also consults about climate change, health, and well-being to groups and organizations. His book, Surviving Climate Anxiety, A Guide to Coping, Healing, and Thriving, will be out later this year, so please make sure to pre-order it. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So, first things first, we all come from quite unique, but also overlapping perspectives in the context of mental health and climate change. And I wanted to start by asking, how did each of you get into this field, and what does the phrase climate mental health mean in your context? Colin, should we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. In 2014, I lived through a 2-year drought in rural KwaZulu-Natal, and then I was an HIV. I'm still an HIV physician, actually, but you wouldn't know that because of the kind of work I do now. Then I wanted to look at how the drought affected people living with HIV in terms of having to make difficult livelihood decisions as around food security, as well as adhering to the antiretroviral therapy. But I was so busy at the time, I couldn't get to it until about 5 years ago when I started looking at that and talking to people around that community. They were also more interested in mental health, just beyond HIV. So in addition to investigating climate and health system, and also how it impacts HIV, we developed a program of research looking at how climate change impacts mental health as well.
Thank you. Andrea?
Yes, so I was always curious about the mind. So I was curious about why some people develop mental illness, some people seem remarkably exempt, and what happens in the brain when people become ill, and can we reverse these changes, and perhaps most importantly, what can we do to support people who struggle with their mental health. So for a long time, these were my main research questions, and I must confess I wasn't specifically interested in the environment or nature or even climate change. But all this changed in 2015 when, together with an artist and an architect, I developed a project called Urban Mind, which was all about understanding why people who live in urban areas are at greater risk of developing mental health issues. And we also wanted to understand what are those factors within a city which might actually make people more resilient to mental health issues. So to my surprise, there was one effect which was by far the strongest, and that was the effect of nature. People who spend time in urban nature tend to be much more resilient to impacts of mental health issues. And similarly, we could observe negative impacts of extreme heat, air pollution. So all of these then got me on a journey to better understand how the environment interacts with the mind to shape our mental health. So to answer your question, what is climate mental health for me? To me, it means recognizing that our mental health is part of a wider ecosystem, and there is no mental health without the health of our planet.
Absolutely. Thank you.
For me, I think there are a couple of different things. We started the organization because when we looked at, I worked in WHO for a while in other parts of global health, there weren't people at the UN and in international meetings talking about mental health, advocating for mental health in the same way they had been respectfully on HIV or TB or malaria. I'd done that work before. And so it was missing. And the second thing that was missing was people from low middle income countries speaking for themselves. So I think one of the things that powered us to start the organization was to enable this, to try and push open the door for mental health, but secondly, to bring people from low middle income countries to be the ones having the conversation. So yes, my organization's based in the UK, but actually over half our team are based in Africa and Asia, and we are deliberately trying to bring people from those regions, based in those regions, to be global advocates. When it comes to mental health and climate change, so we also run what's called the Global Mental Health Action Network. It has 7,000 members in 170 countries. It's a huge mix, and all of you are very welcome, it's free, as a way of engaging people on mental health and again bringing people into the conversations both at a national and a global level. And one of the reasons we started working on climate was because our members were already working on climate. It's already a massive issue for people living in many of those countries, and of course we're talking about Europe as well. And so we could see our members were already trying to make a difference, trying to advocate for change. And so we as an organization wanted to facilitate and support that, but also take those messages to the global level. So we've heard a little bit about it already today, but that's about how do you get mental health up the agenda in the COP? How do you get conversations at the WHO? How do you get national adaptation plans, national determination contributions, including mental health? So we can speak more about that, but that's the angle we're coming from.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Thomas?
Can you all hear me okay, I hope?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's so great to join you. My story, it's interesting. If you go back about 20 years or so, there wasn't the interest in general education about climate change. And so when I was getting started, there was the American Psychological Association had a task force on climate change, and I was getting started as a clinical psychologist with a background in researching nature and mental health. And so they needed people on that task force, and there wasn't at that time any clinical psychologists that were actually studying this issue. So I raised my hand and got involved, and that's led me to where I am today, which is doing some of the early research and since then working in various ways in this area. The idea of climate mental health is such a great question, and all the speakers spoke to different aspects of it. I think in this kind of context, like you're gathering today, one aspect of climate mental health is what I call climate cosmopolitanism, which is really understanding many different ways that people understand the phenomenon of climate change. And often when I'm teaching with a group, I'll remind people of the old parable of the blind people and the elephant, and how when people come upon this big object, they all find different parts of it and think the object is the tail or the head or the side. And I think the climate elephant metaphor is really great for discussions like you're having today, because, you know, it is impossible to see the entirety of the issue. We can only really know how we come into it, and we have to have compassion and humility, understanding that people are going to see this issue quite differently. And the best we can do is be a cosmopolitan and really learn to speak in others' languages. And some people are being crushed by the elephant, some people are sitting on the elephant's back. But I think that one way to be healthy is to understand we have our truth, and then there are many other truths, and we work together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I really, really appreciate that analogy. And I think this is a really good opportunity to pivot over to Collins, who's going to be sharing with us a digital story to highlight the African perspective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next slide, please.
My name is Ashford Salim. I have been living in Mukuru.
I was going to introduce this. So WEMA is a welcome-funded project investigating the impact of extreme weather events on the mental health of vulnerable populations in 4 African countries: Kenya, Mozambique, South Africa, and Burkina Faso. As part of the project, our community members with lived experience of flooding are trained in digital storytelling, and I'll be sharing one of their stories with you now. Okay, thank you.
My name is Ashford Salim. I have been living in Mukuru kwa Ruben for 23 years. I remember the time of heavy flooding like it was yesterday. It was early morning and I was sitting alone at home. I heard a neighbor calling out, "Hey guys, the Kingston Bridge is overflowing and the children need to cross." I pulled on my boots and raincoat and stepped outside. It was drizzling and cold. I could feel goosebumps on my skin. When I arrived at the bridge, I saw water pouring over and many children waiting in their school uniforms. We lifted each one onto our backs and carried them across. My legs got wet and the rain poured heavily. Once the children were safe, we rushed to sit underneath the bridge to hide from the rain. As I was sitting beside my friend, I started feeling worried because I knew that the houses in my neighborhood often flood when it rains. I decided to go home. While walking, I saw a neighbor and asked, "Niaje, umeona mama yangu anywhere ama hayuko?" He replied, "Yes, nimesikia pia yeye akitoa maji hiyo pande." I walked closer to the house. There was water everywhere. It was dirty and the terrible smell hurt my nose and brought tears to my eyes. As I was stepping through the water, I could see trash floating around and feel things touching my feet. I reached home and opened the gate. I found my mother knee-deep in water, using a bucket to scoop water out of the house. I was shocked to see that she was barefoot and her face was dripping down with tears. I called out, "Mom, sasa ndio nafika. Wacha kulia, niambie naweza fanya nini nikusaidie." She responded, "Unasema nisilie na vitu zote kwa nyumba zimeharibika. Ingia unisaidie kuweka vitu zingine juu zisianguke kwa maji." As I was entering the house, I saw her boots and asked, "Kwani mbona hujavaa gumboot?" She answered, "Hata ukivaa kuna maana gani na maji inapita mpaka inaingia kwa gumboot ndani?" I was not happy to see her barefoot because I know that the water brings diseases. We stayed there the whole day, removing water and gathering everything that had fallen. When night came, I slept on the chair with my feet on the table. I was shivering because it was cold and there was still water on the ground. My mom slept in the other room. 2 days passed and I noticed that she was not herself. As the days went by, her health grew worse. Her friend offered to watch over her and gave me her phone to call my older brother because we needed to get her to the hospital. Unfortunately, he lived far away and could not help us easily. A few days later, When I entered my neighbor's house, I found my mother just lying there. She had not eaten for a long time. Thoughts gathered inside my head. I could not concentrate because loud noises kept screaming. I had little money and decided to go to the chemist to try buy some cheap medication. I found myself walking in circles, feeling confused. A man called out, "Niaje bro, mbona unahangaika hivyo?" I replied, "Mam ni mgonjwa na sijui kenye naweza fanya kumsaidia." He introduced himself as a community leader and offered to bring doctors to our house the next day. I remember waiting outside the room, sweat pouring, my heart beating loudly and praying that she would be safe. Eventually, they came out, gave me some medicines and told me that she would be fine. A few days later, I got a call from the leader saying that he would like me to register for a youth program called Climate Works. One day, while we were busy collecting trash from the riverbanks, we met some people from the Nairobi Water Company and decided we could work together. Earlier this year, they gave us some gloves, face masks, boots, rakes and other equipment to help unblock sewer in our community. I am so happy to be part of this program because it has helped so many people.
Thank you. So, Collins, on the basis of that visual story, and you can obviously see the sort of physical, but also the mental impacts on the protagonist in the story. I was wondering if you'd be able to sort of unpack your experience of working with these communities and the vulnerability, but also agency that exists within them. And on that note, what research practices need to do better when working with communities like the ones you engage with?
Okay, thank you. Mukurukwa Ruben is an urban informal settlement in Kenya. And as researchers, what we've noticed is that we need to move beyond the deficit narratives because people in urban settlements also have agency. While co-creating research agendas and talking about vulnerabilities, we need to also surface their strengths. As you could see from that story, that people in informal settlements, they are first responders, they are caregivers, organizers, innovators. So, and we also saw community solidarity coming through and local leadership. So as researchers, I think we have an ethical responsibility to sort of recognize and reinforce that agency while addressing systems that undermine it. Secondly, also, we need to sort of avoid top-down extractive data collection practices. As I said, these are people in the community who have been trained as co-researchers to work with us. So they're not just there to give us their stories, but they're there with us in terms of formulating the study design, data collection and data analysis with interpretation, and they'll be helping with dissemination of the results from the study. So that is what I think meaningful community engagement looks like. And they're also part of the governance structure of the studies. So thirdly, I also think we need to foster long-term engagement. Like a community like Mukukwa Ruben would have noticed waves of researchers come and go, and sometimes they leave nothing behind, but we've built in research capacity development within our project. And hopefully, we don't want this to be a project-specific engagement. We want to be able to engage with them long-term, co-create solutions on the problems that we are identifying, and hopefully with long-term funding, we'll be able to keep that engagement going. So, and then we need to also combine evidence generation with advocacy, because we've just completed a population prevalence of common mental disorders in that community, looking at people exposed to flooding in comparison to those that are not exposed. And we found the prevalence of PTSD to be 44% in those exposed to flooding and 30% in those unexposed. Even regardless of exposure status, the prevalence is so high, 30% in unexposed and 44% in the exposed. I mean, if we tuck these findings away in fancy journals with high impact, the policymakers are not going to read it. So that's why it's important to maximize impact, to combine that with advocacy, to turn the evidence we're generating into policy briefs, because apart from the sort of social dimensions of vulnerability that you've all saw through the story or heard through the story, there's also political dimension to vulnerability. We saw evidence of governance failures, infrastructure neglect, and systemic exclusion, and that's something advocacy can address, or probably activism as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good segue into the work that you're doing, Sarah. And I just wanted to know, sort of on a global level, what is being done to prioritize climate-related health?
That's a huge question. Maybe I'll answer a little bit of it. I think from our perspective, what we've been particularly looking at is around whether or not mental health is considered at a global and then a national level. At the moment, only 3% of national determined contributions reference to mental health. And of the national adaptation plans, we're seeing around less than half reference mental health, and in the non-health one, and also obviously there are non-health ones as well. But only 5% of national adaptation plans and 22% of health and adaptation plans include specific actions to address mental health. So in very practical terms, what does that really mean? So in a lot of countries, they spend between 60 and 85% of their mental health budgets on institutions. That's locking people up. Think about those people and whether or not they then have a climate-controlled environment in which they're living. They can't leave.
Right.
So is that environment climate controlled? What happens if there's an emergency? Is there provisions for flooding, for lack of electricity, for perhaps lack of access for staff? What happens from an emergency food distribution perspective in those institutions? So some really practical things. I think another thing for mental health, and I live with bipolar and anxiety, I'm very open about that. One of my concerns is that what about these drugs that cause problems with thermoregulation? Yeah. Does that mean that I'm not going to be able to take my medication anymore? Right. It takes years to develop new mental health medications. What does that mean for the millions of us that are living on mental health with mental health conditions? These are really urgent things. They affect people's lives today. And to what Colin was saying, when we talk to different partners who are working on this issue in different countries, mental health is a concern now. So if you are in the Caribbean, you're a young person trying to go to school, trying to go to university, you are regularly suffering from disruptions in your schooling or your education. It's struggling for people who are trying to work. So when we had COP, in Azerbaijan, we did a series of case studies about farmers and the impact for them of floods and droughts. That's obviously a universal experience now. So there's some very practical things that need to happen today that need to be included in some of these global but also national plans.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sharing openly about your experiences with bipolar and also medication, which I think leads on quite nicely to the next question, and I'll be asking Andrea. I'm also on SSRIs, and that makes me extremely prone to overheating, especially during heat waves such as now. And I wanted to ask Andrea how extreme heat can influence mental health, and alongside people who are on these sorts of medications, who's most impacted?
Yes. So it's important to consider that extreme heat influences mental health through different types of mechanisms. Because if we don't think about the mechanisms, the pathways linking extreme heat and mental health, then we can't develop effective solutions. So we can roughly say that there are at least 4 categories. There are physiological mechanisms, as you have mentioned, those people who take antidepressants, antipsychotics, but also beta blockers and many other types of medication will experience extreme heat in a more pronounced way due to the body's thermoregulation being affected by the medication. So that's an example of a physiological mechanism. But there are also psychological mechanisms. For example, in our focus groups with lived experience experts, we find that young people worry about climate change, worry about extreme heat and how this might affect their mental health. And obviously being very worried all the time is also something that exacerbates mental health issues. There are also behavioral mechanisms. For example, when it's very hot, we all find it hard to sleep, and we know that sleep is key to mental health. We might also exercise less, and once again, we know that exercise is really important for keeping us healthy, not just in terms of our physical health, but also our mental health. And finally, there are social mechanisms. For example, during periods of extreme heat in a city like London, young people report becoming socially isolated. And over a number of days, this can really affect their mental health. So it's really important to consider the mechanism at play. And of course, this is going to be specific to each group and specific to each location, which means that solutions will also have to be developed in a context-specific way. And this takes us to the next question, which is, who is the greatest risk? So we know that there are well-established risk factors, particularly those people who have an existing physical health condition or an existing mental health condition are at greater risk of a mental health crisis during a heat wave, but also those who have limited mobility or a learning disability are at greater risk because they have lower capacity for adaptation. It's already been mentioned that certain types of medication interferes with the body's thermoregulation, so that also increases risk. And also we know that people with lower income or people who don't have access to cool spaces like the homeless, they're also at greater risk because once again, they have a limited capacity for adaptation. And interestingly, age is also a factor. Young people are at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems during a heat wave. Particularly, they're at greater risk of suicide, whereas older people are at greater risk of depression. So we need to be mindful of that. Now, I've mentioned quite a few groups who are at greater risk, but it's important to also think about protective factors. And I just want to mention two of these. So one is social cohesion. If someone reports having strong social connections within their community, with their families, friends, they will have less of a risk to experiencing mental health issues during heat wave. And the other one, which I feel very strongly about, is a tree canopy. If you live in a neighborhood with higher levels of tree canopy, of course this will mitigate the urban heat island effect, which means that your home and your neighbors' homes will be not as hot. And this is really important because, as someone mentioned earlier, we spend the majority of our time in our homes. And I personally feel that there's so much evidence for greening our cities, indirect effects through the mitigation of the urban heat island effect, but also direct effects, because having trees, plants, is something that directly benefits our mental health, helps us make us more resilient. So the evidence is there, we just need to embrace it and implement it.
Thank you. And Thomas, I'd just like to kind of build off of that, because these are sort of preventative measures and perhaps more sort of wider systems change measures within urban environments, but you focus on trauma-informed care. And as like psychologists, I'd just like to sort of describe what that looks like and explore perhaps what's missing from the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we can do our.
You on mute? There we go. I think
Is
we
that
can
better?
hear you. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think we can all do our own work. Everyone that's attending today, and there's basically three kinds of mental health impacts of climate change. There's the direct disaster impacts that we've been hearing about, like the young man with the floods, and then there's the indirect impacts, all the ripple effects through society, refugees, migrants, issues with the economy, or with sufferings of incarcerated people. And then we have the vicarious impacts of just sitting and observing the dangers and the damages, even if we're not in harm's way. And we can ask our own self these questions: what have we experienced? So when we're thinking about trauma, we can think about, well, has your trauma been through directed disaster, or concerns about the economy and your business, or just your ethical sort of suffering with the weight of this? And that's an entree into this. The general trend has been, unfortunately, that many of us, even in this gathering, have sat with the vicarious impacts for quite some time, if we have certain values and ethics. But the disasters are all finding us, and when people are actually exposed to a disaster, that's often when they're kicked over into this action phase that we're talking about. But underneath this, there's a saying in therapy: we hurt where we care. And so the reason that this is traumatizing is because these issues or events impact our values, impact our identity, impact our ethics. And so the key here in treatment is, we're not trying to create more victims, we're trying to create more survivors. And we need to check in on what values are being impacted, what ethics, what meaning. And when we focus on people's values, and maybe later on I'll talk about environmental identity, but when we get into people's values, identity, and meaning, this is what's being threatened. And when they can express those things, that becomes their foundation for action.
Brilliant, thank you. And I wanted to open this question up to all of you, because you've all offered very different perspectives on climate change and mental health, and we've perhaps spoken about it more broadly. But as we know, the term eco-anxiety has become quite a popularized term to describe a lot of relationships between mental health and climate change. And when I was researching for my book, one of the things that was really evident to me, especially when talking to activists from frontline communities, is that they didn't really resonate with this term eco-anxiety, and they also felt like it had an element of futurity which didn't account for the trauma that they had experienced as a result of systems of oppression intersecting with climate change. And so I just wanted to ask, how do we ensure that this conversation stays inclusive and relevant to those most affected? And in your research, is this a term that people ascribe to? Did they feel like they related to it? And what other offerings could you give to people who don't necessarily relate to this term eco-anxiety?
I can start. In the network that we run, people don't eco-anxiety is that thing that the West or high-income countries are talking about. I mean, that may not be experienced for everybody, but certainly for quite a lot of our partners in Africa or Asia or Middle East, it's not an existential question. It is a reality every day. So the anxiety piece, it goes beyond kind of an anticipation, I guess, is I think what you're getting at. So certainly it wasn't a term that resonated, but when you talk about, and even climate change, the environment as a whole is changing. Exactly. So we'll come later to air pollution. We'll talk about other things that are impacting people's environment. So it's seen as, for many of our colleagues, it's seen as something that's in a broader way, changing the overall way in which we live. And how do we adapt for that, and how do we change for that? But also, frankly, we're quite angry. Like, why should we have to adapt and change? Sure. People are very frustrated. They're frustrated with the polluters. We've heard a bit about that, but I feel like we haven't heard enough frustration and anger yet. There's been a lot of quite passive conversations today, but people are really angry. So I think that also comes across sometimes in some of the work around mental health, which is the anger and the sense in which, how do we make sure we don't feel futile in the face of really difficult changes and challenges? And then how do we redress that balance through government action, but also, to the point earlier, critically community action, as where something where you feel that you have a direct impact and can feel a value.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was reading some research papers a few years ago that suggested that anger was actually a more powerful catalyst for taking action and mitigating experiences like eco-anxiety than the actual feeling of eco-anxiety and the paralysis that comes from it. Collins, I wanted to ask you, from the African perspective.
Yeah, so one of our digital stories in South Africa actually captured eco-anxiety quite nicely. But the background to that was that in 2022, South Africa experienced catastrophic flooding that sort of resulted in about 600 fatalities, 20,000 homes were destroyed, 40,000 people displaced. And then just last year, a tornado tore through one of the towns, killing some people. So now, as soon as the skies become overcast, people start to get anxious, they look really worried. Those I work with start to pack up and leave because they don't know whether if it starts raining, if it will stop raining. Like the last time, their experience of 2022 has just sort of left them with this chronic anticipatory mental health effect. So people get really anxious as soon as it starts raining in South Africa now.
Yeah.
So I'm no expert in eco-anxiety, but to me, it often sounds like almost like a sort of illness that some people have, or we need to help those young people who have eco-anxiety. Actually, to me, it seems something that is a completely normal response to the situation. Yeah. What we need to do is address the causes of eco-anxiety from the outset. So I think it's a tricky concept because, as I said, it's often presented in the media in a pathologized way, whereas actually it's a healthy response to a very urgent situation. So I'm just thinking, perhaps trying to frame all of these not as doom and gloom, but in more positive ways. What can we practically do to address things, and sometimes even simple things like starting a vegetable garden, doing something within your community, which will increase social cohesion and will also increase the amount of plants and trees. It's a win-win because it brings direct benefits to the individuals and the community, but it also brings direct benefits to the environment where these people live and work. So. I think it might be time to reframe eco-anxiety as a normal response.
Absolutely. In fact, that's some of the work that researchers like Caroline Hickman are doing at the University of Bath, where she tries to depathologize an experience like eco-anxiety, because it's truly a rational and adaptive response to the times that we're living in. And I think that leads on quite nicely to this conversation around prevention and also the true causes of something like eco-anxiety and other ill mental health in response to climate change. Because to me, I argue that actually dismantling the fossil fuel industry is good for my eco-anxiety, as 86% of all carbon emissions in the last decade are owed to coal, oil, and gas. And on the subject of prevention, as a psychologist, Thomas, what would you argue are some really important preventative measures to ensure people's well-being in a time of climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Coming back to eco-anxiety, there's an elephant of eco-anxiety because there's many different ways to think about it. The term eco-anxiety, really emerged in the early aughts around people's concerns around chemicals in the environment. Actually, it wasn't originally used for climate change. And so eco-anxiety is literally ecological anxiety. It's threats coming from systems around us. And it's going to manifest differently. And so rather than getting caught in the vast number of threats, again, coming back to our values and our identity, everyone has an environmental identity, a way they think about themselves in terms of nature and the natural world and their place in global systems, and their basic values that are threatened by climate issues, either idealistic values for oneself or altruistic values or ecocentric values for other species in the system. So I think turning the conversation to the person's identity and their values is really helpful. It depends on the person. Some people have this somewhat well developed, and then they can just tap into this. And then for other people, it's more implicit, and we need to be educating ourselves about this. And some people obviously live in in nicer places in the world where they can have some positive connections with nature and the natural world, and other people, again, are on the front lines of social justice and change. But really, bringing it back to our environment, our environmental identity, our environmental values is the first step, because that's empowering. That's empowering. And then the basic mental health goal is to expand our capacity in two directions. One is to deal with the difficulty, because there's a learning curve in this work. As you get involved in it, you're going to learn about a lot of troubling issues. But there's also a learning curve in terms of the positive side. Think of all the expertise that you've seen today and all these people that are working. There's a paradox that it's quite inspiring to get involved as well, because there's a bright ecology of all the positive things you learn. So almost the biggest challenge is building our capacity to take in the good, because our nervous system is naturally going to focus on threats. So how can we balance and take in the good, honestly, legitimately? That's not bright-siding or anything. That's literally the reality of the situation. Think of all the gifted people that are gathered today. And how can we help people sit with both of those? And then the art is balancing where people are at any given moment. All of us can fall into feeling disappointed and scared and gloomy at different times, and then helping people toggle between the dark and the light.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And my final question to all of you is, if you could challenge this audience to act on one piece of information from today's discussion, what would that be? Collins, do you want to start?
From the context of climate and mental health, I'll say plant more trees.
Amen. Andrea?
Yeah, so I'm going to say something similar. I think in this conversation, there is a bit of an elephant in the room, which is the fact that, while we all say that we need more trees, we need to connect with nature, actually, plenty of research is showing that the opposite is happening. We are becoming more and more disconnected from the natural world, and this is especially true for young people. The ones who are most affected are going to be most affected by climate change. Their life is becoming increasingly screen-based. And this, I think, needs to be part of the conversation. So, going back to what you've just said, my invitation to the audience would also be to not only just plant a tree, but maybe create a mini meadow in a tree pit, or start a vegetable garden. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I predict that that intimate relationship with nature that you develop when you're actually touching a plant, a tree, you're planting a seed, you're seeing a seed grow. It's something really powerful that changes the way you think about yourself within the environment, and also you then find yourself talking to your friends, your family, your community, and you're kind of influencing other people in a positive way. So to answer your question, plant a tree, start growing your food, and plant a mini meadow or anything else.
Thank you.
So this is a mental health session. Those are great and really important, but I guess it would be beholden on me as a mental health advocate to say break the stigma. Mm-hmm. Start talking about your mental health in the way that, I'm very grateful that TORI also spoke about it, but start talking about your mental health and talk to other people. And you've heard some of who may be most vulnerable, but also some solutions and ways of supporting people. But when it comes to mental health, it needs to start with breaking the stigma.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, great question. I think in terms of mental health, we need to see if we can transcend a fixed mindset in general about how we think about ourselves and problems, and develop a growth mindset that we can grow and change. And that includes ourselves, our families, our communities, and also the world. And that allows us to sort of imagine what happiness and flourishing might look like in the world as it is now.
Brilliant. Can we please give a massive round of applause to our amazing panelists?